Today's topic touches on what is, I think, quite pertinacious in the social media realm, particularly on X, formerly known as Twitter, whereby there has been a debate proceeding across the last few days in which the topic of immigration in America, but particularly the H-1B visa immigration of quote-unquote skilled labor and its necessity or its superfluousness to uplifting what is this idea of America. And this is particularly, vociferous in the right side, the conservative part of the political milieu in America, versus in the left. I think the debate is fairly settled in that they consider a blanket immigration policy as good, ipso facto thereby saying any type of immigrant is necessarily good, so there's no need to debate much about it, other than yes, we would like more immigrants of every type, creed, colour, kith, kin. Whereas the right has a bit more nuanced view on immigration to that extent, is that we are seeing or bearing witness to the proliferation of a certain creed around immigration, and that stems from the Make America Great Again, particularly with the shibboleth of Donald Trump in sending them back, as in sending illegal immigrants back. Now, you have to take immigration, as we've done before on this channel, in a very nuanced way, because there are several strains of what immigration means, and the historical implications of immigration have no bearing other than definitionally on current immigration trends. What was probably seen as a beneficial or a boon in the 19th century to America, a land which was depopulated by the deaths of the Indians, and then manifest destiny pushing ever westward, needing more and more people to populate the countryside, had a beneficial effect for the American people in that sense. America at that time being composed primarily of European descent, or basically only European descent, and of that Western and Northern European only. And so saying that, I think we're touching on two trends here. One, this idea of what is America, and because America was founded on this iconoclastic immigration mode, a colonization which was not necessarily done in the same vein as previous colonies, and no colony thereafter had the same methodology around its spawning. So you have a very unique case with America in that it got the best blood from the best countries at the time, in a way that has now led to the expansion and growth and lastly, I would say, the crystallization of what America meant. And in that, we can touch on some topics. And then secondarily to this, I think, is what does modern America need out of immigration, and what that means from a policy and political perspective. All of this was very evident to anyone who's read Spengler, that the age of Megalopolis, these world cities, does nothing but gravitate and magnetize people to it. These are baseless people with no cultures, no considerations. They are this mass, an atomized mass, if you will, no longer any belonging to any place or part, and being very rootless. Now, this, we can quote from Hour of Decision here, is epitomized in this, saying, "This materialism of the late Megalopolis is a practical cast of thought and action, whatever the faith may be that accompanies it. It is the mode of regarding history and public and personal life economically, and of looking upon economics not as a thing of vocations and the content of lives, but as the method by which the least exertion, the most money and pleasure can be secured, panem et circenses." Most people nowadays do not realize how materialistic, and he goes on to say that the materialistic version of philosophy, and this is a Marxist strain, has beheld us in this petri dish of experimentation of what does a materialist post-spiritual, post-religious society look like, and you get America, and this is what Spengler had the second, I would say, part of his thesis on in Hour of Decision, which is what will it look like going forward. And this is to say, I think America is just living this out, this idea that they have these broad, monolithic entity of people whereby you can just continue to add any admixture to it, and via the miracle of a melting pot, you get the same America just ever building, ever expanding, growing and proliferating. This is obviously not true. America in many regards has become worse over the last, say, 30, 40 years. And you can thank, I think, both sides of the polity for that. There's no reason to say it's the Democrats or the Republicans' fault. I think it's a generational fault. The entire political sphere after World War II was a successive, you could say, fiasco when it came to having a coherent policy about what was to be the new America, the hegemony America. What is the American empire? Do we continue to grow? And the moral decision was to be diplomatic rather than using force and arms, which has secured power for eons. America decided that they would try to be clever. They would try to imbue their political and diplomatic aims in the way that the English did, which was via this very clever mechanism of diplomatic power, which was backed up by a military hard power, but worked much more subtly on the way treaties were set up and threats in a much more fractious world, whereas America tried to implement the same thing rather than just commanding, which was definitely a massive, well, I would say a F up, let's be polite. But in any case, the Spenglerian decline, as witnessed and evidenced by him, is just being borne out in this. And as I said before, we saw this with Musk and Vivek, who have commented now on the situation that a Indian, a first generation or second generation Indian, is as much an American as, which is always implied here, a white American or a European descent American. We had a movie about this called Gangs of New York, where the idea has been treated, not obviously exclusively to Gangs of New York, but this is a very common old idea that somehow America, being that it is a nation of immigrants, is fine to just give up whatever identity it had and be welcoming, because being welcoming was the identity apparently of Americans, as a kind of disposition, but also as a deportment. Whether this is true or not is definitely up for debate, and I would say it's not the case that you can have free-for-all infinity immigration, even just of Westerners to a Western country, because you do despoil and dilute a culture here in the Weberian sense. So Max Weber wrote extensively on this. It's called a subjective feeling. Culture is this common understanding you have between methods and ends, between a social group, people. It's a very salient and constructed term around how we actually interact on that level. There has to be some deep and understanding connection and level of fluidity between one and another, that we can assume things. There can be a tacit understanding around how we act and interact. This obviously evaporates as soon as you introduce alien elements into a society, and you get a massive distrust and fractious setup. And in doing so, you more or less, I say remove, but you definitely despoliate what was once an identity, a common identity, a communality, into nothing but notional and fragmentary cohesion. It's this, we're banded together by jurisdiction or by a bounds, like a real bounds, as Schmidt would have it, in the physical realm, in the telluric sense. But regardless, we want to discuss here the practicalities around that. What is it that we can think of when we think that Musk and Vivek and any number of Trumparian appointees will come to the game touting a immigration yes and no policy, the nuance here being the distinction in the difference. And for us, I think we, on the Faustian side, on that side that cares much more about our destiny. And I think Musk here has been hoodwinked to a degree by a lot of different either media or social pressures, and his bubble, which exists both in the element of his economic station but also in his geographical location, has not allowed him to expand his viewpoint, or at least have a tableau of the real or the reality of the situation for the normal person. The American who's grown up in what was Americana in the 1950s doesn't exist. You have vast swathes of this consumer materialism across the United States, which harvests culture and dispenses it back to people in a very minute and easily digestible form. It's milk toast as it was, in the sense that you've bland and you've generic, and everything about it is made for the consumer. And Baudrillard has a thesis on this as well, but it's just to say that America epitomizes this movement of we can make things consumable, and that everything is now just symbolic rather than real. And Trump and Elon does not quite grasp this very evidently. I think he has the one sense, the vast Faustian will to infinite, and that's very obvious from not just his wealth but also his prodigious aims towards making it to Mars and accelerating our technology in a way that's sufficiently efficient. It is very Western. He's very Faustian in that sense, and that's why we have this cognitive dissonance with Elon, or at least from this perspective, if we call ourselves the third position here, is because he embodies so many of the good traits of the Faustian man that it's very hard to reconcile this with the obvious flaws in his ways and his means of interacting with other people in society in general. Because he's not a natural leader, he's not that charismatic Mussolini type figure where you carry through an idea into the person and you become the spirit and you speak through from the gods to the world, to the people. Much more around his understanding of it is too scientific. It's this almost post 90s atheism, science first. Let's have a look at what scientism is as a religion when it comes to applying the lived reality of someone to the world. And this is where it falls down, because we all understand that you can't treat people and cultures as strict entities which are manageable economically or mathematically or in some data form. These are lived realities of real people. Caesar was a man. He wasn't reduced to being some biography told by some accounting historian of deeds. His whole life was a saga lived, and that's what Elon doesn't comprehend here around the cultural aspect. Culture is a living organism. It has the cycle for a reason. You have a decline and a death because it was alive. One is not allowed to be without the other. It has to be the become to the becoming. So this is how we can, I think, firstly treat this. The second thing I think is when you interact with very smart people in one domain, and this is particularly Silicon Valley and tech companies, you have people with very high IQs, but they apply them in very singular ways around problem solving. And when you treat everything as a problem to be solved rather than necessarily a life which is just lived, then you lose the connection between these two things of a man, his deeds, and his saga, and the spirit which embodies him, which then goes into informing his goals and his destiny and how he drags himself to why is that man headed that way in that direction. Not the how do I get to where I want to go, but the why before that. That's what's lost, and that's what these third worlders coming in on their H1Bs or their O1 or whatever visa they have, where they're super smart, great, and they're here to solve the problem for a person that actually has the vision. Also, they're involved in a process that they can't conceptualize. It doesn't manifest itself in their minds to be able to understand why they're here solving this problem. Why is it existential for me to solve the problem as a Faustian man versus it's a very economic problem for some third worlder who just wants to earn as much money as possible because they see the system as a reflection of just reward, input and reward, input and reward. And that's how transactional and materialistic they are. In every sense of the word, the rest of the world sees the white European and American Anglo countries as a system which can be exploited. That's all it exists for. It exists to give them things. How they interact with it is just some function of how do I get something I want out of it, usually monetary reward. And that's not even being parsimonious with my opinion. That's just a pure fact. You have different immigrants taking advantage of Western cultures, Occidental cultures, in different ways. So the Chinese will treat Western culture differently than the Indians will, than the Arabs will, than the Africans will. But they all seek to, well, you say this in very gross terms, that they all seek to rape it and pillage it in ways that they feel is justified, in the sense that they can revoke or invoke, some past historical sufferance that their forefathers went through, and then morally justify their need to take advantage and recoup that. But in general, that's the reason that they do this, is because it's a natural reaction to encountering something where you feel there's a weakness. You say, I encounter this dying animal, let me kill it and try and eat it, because I have no consideration about nursing it back to health, or what considerations around it as a spiritual animal could mean. It's a very materialistic transaction. I see something, I need it, let's go and get it no matter what. And hence and thus, we are here at QED. But the biggest problem, I think, is that this was a shock to people, that this was their opinions. Of course this is their opinions. Most of them are third worlders by either first, second, third generation, or they are either Middle Easterners by lineage, if they're Israeli Hebrew, or they're Levantine, Syrian, Iranian. All of these people come to America to benefit. They're not there to live as an American, other than notionally, as in it's very. If we were going if we're going to say that America was no longer the greatest country in the world from an economic standpoint, they would all leave, because there's nothing inherent in why they're there. They're not Amerindian. They haven't lived there for centuries, and then they thus have this connection to the world, to the grasslands and to the animals. The American forefathers were the pioneering men who founded the country. So if you can trace your lineage back and your genetic heritage back to that, obviously there's a reason to want to stay and build that up and maintain that. But otherwise, if you're a first, second, third, fourth generation immigrant, you're only there just because it's advantageous to your situation to be there. Why immigrate anywhere else? Because you want to better your life, and the way that they encapsulate, the way that they orientate their lives is always materialistic. It's always economic. There's no other considerations around their own welfare. This is how they live, and this is why they're seen as such a plague, is because they're demonstrably nefarious in their techniques around interacting with native Faustian populace. And so as I say, it's not to be xenophobic in the way that, well, first of all, you're not afraid, but it's not xenophobic in the sense that you have a blanket reaction to every single person from a different country, but it's just necessarily the reasons they're here are negative. So they want to take advantage of and exploit and or be somehow bettering themselves at the cost of the local populace. So we can see this in inflation of several sectors, but most evidently in housing sector and in education. You have rampant inflation on these two, because of the costs to provide them just increase exponentially with every added enrollee or homeowner. And because you're allowing for international students and international homeowners, you are party to what is now a runaway system. Boomers have gotten used to ever increasing gains on their property portfolio, and also credentialism in hiring. The better the university, the more degrees, the higher the grades. So rather than the naturalistic methodology of sorting into a hierarchical society that we normally had in the Faustian way, where there's a lot of trust and there's risk-taking as it corresponds to people's disposition and the way that they are, we've formalized and crystallized all of these things to a degree that we depersonalize them, but we also deracinate them, and we make them very typically, I would say, atheistic in that way. But they're very much taken as this abstract. We've made it such that you take the person out of all of these things and you become just an economic unit. So we've deconstructed what is a living society to be atomistic, materialistic consumer society. And this is where the lefties actually have some pull here. They don't understand why they're right, but they've wandered into why they hate modern society in that same guise. But the solution to this is never going to be more immigration. And if you ever think that would be something that makes a society better, you will never see the evidence for that. And you can cast exceptions, but then if you have an exception to a rule, you've proved the rule by definition. And so I think the problems become, well, not only multifarious, but also dependent. We have what I have is a Hydra here, because I think that demonstrates you cut one head off, two more will grow in its place. There is no way to defeat this. You cannot have this blanket immigration technique where we consider ourselves an immigrant nation of immigrants, like America does, and then you can just proceed to invite people through the system in various ways, which are never beneficial. So foreign students are there to take advantage of the institutions. You have, depending on where the foreign student is from, the either preponderance to wanting to stay forever, thus becoming a dependent on the system, influencing culture from their perspective as I'm an American now, carrying through my old traditions into what is new traditions, diluting American traditions, or you have IP theft and I would say intellectual thievery, in that once you start to steal the systematic information and data of an education system and transport it back home, you're trying to enrich those back home at the cost of the competitive advantage of the home country, right? You're thinking, oh, I'm trading my money for an education, thereby I should be allowed to take that home. But what is really happening is IP theft to a large degree. And then I think it depends on which students, but most of them, particularly from the third world, just cheat. There's a massive case in almost every single Western European, Western university of cheating from almost every single third world immigrant community. You also have illegal immigrants in America. We have discussed this on several other videos, but that's a fairly obvious one in terms of you happen to have a massive drain on a system perpetually. And the current incentivization, and Milton Friedman said this, it's obvious you can't have free immigration in a welfare state. The idea that you can offer services to anyone regardless of who they are incentivizes that very activity, that behavior. You've made it a habit. You've habitualized certain things. If you say you can move here and work and get healthcare and education for your kids at no cost to yourself, other than the small potential risk you might be deported at some time, is going to be something that everyone says, okay, well, the risk is so low and the reward is so high. Why would I not take advantage of this? And you can see here, and this was from 2007, so 15 years ago, 17 years ago, in a recent debate with Dana Griswold of the Kennedy Institute, he pointed out the paradox that you want to grant amnesty and open borders now, but then work on building a wall around the welfare later, which it doesn't work. You can't give someone something and then take it back later. We know this from all types of democracy. Once you allow something to have happened, then repealing it is nigh on impossible. So the best outcome, or the best assurance against this, is to foresee it and not do it. And once again, it's hard to do that because you're in a situation where everyone behind you, and this is when I'm talking about this philosophically, it's like anyone behind what is the Caesarian vanguard. So anyone who's in the Caesarian mindset is an understanding of what's happening next. If you read Spengler, you know what will happen. You understand how the traversing of the next 5 centuries is going to happen in very broad terms. But it's to say that if you're surprised by these developments, then you're behind, because these things happened 20 years ago. You finding out about them today and making it a hullabaloo, and Elon Musk and Vivek being attacked on X, is just demonstrative of how far back everyone is. These things have already happened and have been happening for 20 years. Why were they not issued and addressed then? Is because those of us who alarmed or raised the alarm on these things were not heeded. You call them schizos, or you say, okay, but you're trying to tackle really small issues that don't matter. When you understand what the thin edge of a wedge is, then you understand why that they become important before they're actually demonstrably important or problems. This is to say then that you're dealing with a class of billionaires, and this is who most of the America First from the California Silicon Valley guys are. So you have your David Sacks and your Elon Musk and your Vivek and innumerable others, tech guys potentially mostly, but there are some finance guys, where the thought of America comes down to how it enriched them. And this is the case of at least the distinction between at least the Faustian, the Western immigrant to America who's enriched, adds value back into the country in ways that the third world immigrant will never. They won't integrate because they can't. It's impossible. And that's just from a physiological point of view. Very obviously, if you don't look like an American, you can't be an American. But secondarily to that is you have this cultural impact of a community setup where you have now an Indian community or an American Indians. You have American Italians, you have American Irish, but, and going back further, right, you have a distinct delineated community. This is negative. Once you establish this, it can only expand other than if you specifically target it as a cancer and trying to excoriate it. It doesn't happen otherwise, and it won't. There's no, obviously, the public appetite for this is done only at the whim of the Caesar. There's no other way for this. There's no election, there's no policy, there's no debate. You can't go into a mindset of saying, we don't want this anymore, get rid of it, because it's unappealing in a intellectual sense, rather than the natural and data-driven sense would tell you these are actually beneficial things if you want to keep your community sacred to that degree. It's this access to Western society which has allowed people to think that they by default have access. And so rather than it's a privilege, it's actually a right, and you have a snowballing effect thereof. And then you have obviously on the other side of these, not just the you could say the innocent perpetrators, but in the sense then you have the malicious perpetrators, the ones who are doing it on purpose, and the ones who are saying, yes, I don't care, or yes, I'm doing it and I'm going to do it more because I know it's going to be deleterious for those others who experience it. These can be rent seekers, profiteering, all of these things where they're enriching themselves, as we said before, parasitically from the host nation. And this has been the case of almost every large empire. You go back to the Chinese Empire, even ironically enough, the Indian Empire 3,000-4,000 years ago. There's the same exact developments happen. And you obviously have the gainsayers and the naysayers on both sides. But there's one historical reality to this situation. That is what it is, unfortunately. The other effect is immigration fraud, as the third I say here, but where you have green card marriages, things like that, where you have a system which can be defrauded. We take in the Anglosphere, particularly in the Western Europe, Occidental society, the idea that you have high trust from a systems that exist to benefit everybody. So if you uphold them, this is why the corruption index, if you look at a corruption index, is very low in almost every Western European country and very high in every other country across the world. It's because we in Western Europe have a high belief in that if there's a trust in a system, then the system performs as it should. And unfortunately, that is not a shared belief. And so once you start allowing people to participate in a system that they don't believe needs to be upheld from a trust perspective, they just abuse it. Ipso facto, we get what we get in immigration fraud, foreign workers. This is where the H-1B visa, O-1 visa, all these, we need high skill immigrants comes in. And this is the debate today. It's one head of the Hydra. And that's why I don't give it as much focus in this video, is just because it's actually just a symptom of the actual issue, or even if it's an issue, the actual development. And that's to say, the foreign worker is doing what he's incentivized to do. And that's to say, we want cheap labor, and we want to have a noose around their necks around, if you perform, you will maintain your residency, and if you don't, then you will be deported. And that's to the benefit of American shareholders, which we have reduced to economic units, and America becomes just a GDP figure rather than a country. And then lastly, into migration, and I think this is probably the next topic that will be discussed at some point, where you have a lot of issues around gentrification, but you just have this intermigration of people both in from the countryside to cities, and then from certain cities and regions to even bigger cities. So there's a segment of the population which never resided in, say, New York or Silicon Valley or San Francisco or LA any point in time up until when they were born and moved there in their 20s. And once they hit their 50s, may leave, and or their next generation of kids will move to an even bigger city or an even more important place, because that's how the opportunity migration works. And this destroys communities, obviously, by the natural fact that there's no carried over history. And when you don't have that, then you don't have a culture. And this is how we see this massive dilution of American culture, both totality, but also regionally. Lastly, I'll just leave you with this, which is another Spenglerian quote from his Hour of Decision. The scene of this revolution of life, its foundation, and, at the same time, its expression, is the megalopolis, which is found arising in the late period of all cultures. Into this world of stone and petrification flock ever-growing crowds of peasant folk uprooted from the land, the masses in the terrifying sense. Formless human sand from which artificial and therefore fleeting figures can be kneaded. Parties, organizations modelled on program and ideal, but in which that inherent power of growth that the course of the generations has saturated with tradition, and that most of all expresses itself in the fruitfulness of all life, the instinct for the permanence of family and race, is extinct. And abundance of children, the chief sign of a healthy race, becomes tiresome and absurd. This is the gravest sign of the egoism of the megalopolins, who have themselves become atoms of the egoism, which is the opposite, not of present-day collectivism. Between these two, there is no difference. A pile of atoms is no more alive than a single one, but of the urge to live on in the blood of posterity, in the creative care for it, in the lastingness of the name. Cold intelligence, on the other hand, that solitary bloom, the weed of the pavements, sprouts in incredible masses. I think it's just powerful here to understand how Spengler has foreseen this exact scenario, and why a country like America will never resemble its true or its early form. That is gone. That America is dead, and there's no way that anyone can allow for the return of it.